Hello, everyone. This is Stephen with Democracy Demythologized, where I talk with experts about issues facing democracy around the world. And today I'm talking with Dr. Jing Xu. She studied the Chinese education system for years and is also navigating her own education with her own son in Seattle in the US. Education in both countries are being significantly reshaped by competition and anxieties around how to best prepare kids for the real world. In particular, she analyzes moral education and what it means to prepare our kids to be, quote unquote, good people in society. I think our conversation boils down to how hard it is to be a parent. Why must parenting feel impossible in the modern age? Let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Jing Xu. How are you doing today?
Good, very good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah, so you currently live in Seattle.
Yes.
You have done a lot of research around the early childhood development in China. I most specifically associate you with Shanghai, with the big mega city there. Do you want to give the one or two sentence version of what you do?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Jing Xu, and in Chinese, Mandarin is Xu Jing. And I'm an anthropologist now at the University of Washington, living in Seattle. And I've done research about children, especially moral development and moral education of different age groups, from early childhood and now my projects all the way to adolescence, mostly in Chinese culture, contemporary China, and also martial law era Taiwan. And I'm also doing cross-cultural comparative work in collaboration with psychologists. And that research involves looking at Chinese children in America.
That makes sense. That's awesome. So, yeah, I love to kind of pick your brain about what the school system is like in China, and you've done a lot of. We'll focus on that for now, and then maybe branch off into some of the others over time. But what? Yeah. So, can you maybe give us for anyone unfamiliar? So you did research in among preschoolers in
Right.
do you also want to give the kind of the short couple sentence version of what you did?
Sure. Yeah. So that was my doctoral dissertation work. And I lived in Shanghai for a year from 2011 to 2012. And at the time, I was also a mother of a young child. My child was in that preschool. So I spent a year doing anthropological work, looking at how children grew up in the Chinese metropolitan Shanghai environment, and specifically focusing on how they become little moral persons. So that's the dissertation work, which then turned into my first book, published in 2017 by Stanford University Press, called The Good Child.
Yeah, this is very interesting. So, yeah, I'm curious about what you found, and maybe in this, if you want to talk about for anyone unfamiliar, what the Chinese education system is like. I guess particularly for young people. I think often in at least in the U.S. we tend to associate Chinese education with being very intense and
Mhm.
having a lot of spending a lot of time studying and a lot of stress and things
Right.
like this. But yeah, in your experience, what's it been like?
Yeah, so the Chinese school system, one thing I wanted to clarify, it was a preschool, but there is no exact counterpart in English translation because the school I studied, it has children from youngest age two, which was my son, to all the way to six. So it technically includes, if you compare the American system, includes both pre-K and K. So in that case, in the Chinese system, the kindergarten year was part of the preschool system. So not the kind of elementary school system, if that makes sense. So after age 6, you go to elementary school, starting from grade 1. So K grade is not in the elementary school system. So that's a little bit confusing, but in Chinese it's called 幼儿园. It's from pre-K to K. And then it is a very, very competitive educational system. I grew up in China. I was a post-80. I was born in the 80s. So even then, the educational competition was already quite intense. And we did have to learn a lot and all kinds of exams up to college entrance exam, which was the most brutal and important exam for any Chinese children growing up in China. But in the preschool stage, children, of course, they have to learn all kinds of things, right? They have to learn to observe collective order, listen to teachers, and get along with other kids. So there are a lot of social emotional development there, and that's why I also focus on moral development. But they also learn a lot of academic content and already did a lot of extra curriculum work, even at the preschool stage. So I would say, yeah, it's to contextualize, it was already more than a decade ago, 2011 to 2012, in Shanghai, which is, I would say, the most globalized Chinese city. So it was kind of the frontier of China's globalization and has a lot of good educational resources. And these children are the middle class, urban middle class children, and that's a private school, private preschool, pre plus K school. But in the Chinese system too, they have to have both government-funded public schools, even at pre-K, and private schools. And these children, once they have to face the very important hurdle at the time, which is to transition to elementary school. It's called 幼小衔接. Is to transition to elementary school, you have rigorous exam and interview in order to get, if you want to get into a good school, not just based on where you live and school district. So you can see that by that age, at early childhood, toddlerhood, there's already a lot of competition, and kids do cram school, they learn English, they learn math Olympics, and all sorts of things, also music, instruments, and other calligraphy. And that's more than a decade ago. Now the competition is even more intense. So that's the general picture and the evolution. In terms of my own work, I focus less on the academic aspect. I focus more on how do children learn what is fair, what is unfair? How do they learn to care for others? Or how do they learn to obey to hierarchy? Who's the authority figure? And what does an authority figure, what kind of power does an authority figure have? And how to get along with other kids? And so that's more my focus, the moral development part in that research. And part of the reason I focused on moral development, because I think morality is a fascinating topic, especially in Chinese society. That has been the focus of Chinese culture for millennia. But also at that particular time point in history, Chinese society was going through a lot of changes. And there was a lot of discussion about moral crisis. They're like low trust, or if an elderly person walk on the street, you will feel that you might be exploited. So meaning there's low trust, and people are talking about strangers and not helping others in need and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of social debate at the time concerning the decline of morality. And that gets reflected in educational sphere too, because Chinese society really value education, even from a very young age. Also, another part of that is that preschool I studied, and that in that particular time, historical moment, it was still under China's one-child policy. So China's one-child policy started from the late 1970s, implemented mostly in urban areas. And then it ended like a decade ago. Now China has relaxed its birth planning policy, and fertility rate has been low. But anyway, back then, it was still one-child policy. So there was still this discourse and anxiety surrounding, okay, are these only children, singletons, are they too spoiled? Are they too selfish? They're too self-centered. They don't have siblings to grow up with. And they enjoy all the resource and love from 4 grandparents, 2 parents, all poured down to this one child. So there was a lot of anxiety about how these kind of children are growing up. So that's why I was finding the intersection of morality and education in that moment of Chinese society. And that's why I did the research. And this also answers, for me, a more fundamental anthropological question. That is, how do humans become moral persons?
Yeah, this makes total sense. I guess in the little that I've encountered with the Chinese education system, the little I understand, I've seen those 2 threads, the kind of the thread of competition and the thread of morality. One thing, and this might not be the case, but it's something at least I've seen or sensed, so I want to hear your thoughts on it. It seems like those either pull in different directions or at least can pull in different directions. Like morality tends to pull towards moral education, in my experience, tends to pull towards homogenization. It tends to pull towards everyone being the same. Like, how do you respond in this situation? What's the right way to respond when you see an old person walking down the street, to use that example, and this is the right way, this is what you're supposed to do. Everyone is supposed to do that. Everyone is supposed to do A, B, and C. It's singular in that sense. But then competition tends to push towards distinction on a pretty fundamental level. If you and I are competing to be the best student, and I'm trying to be a better student than you, I'm trying to outperform you, then I'm trying to make myself distinct in a significant way. And it seems like those, at least to me, I wonder if those pull in different directions in China, but also they have different standards of assessment. Like morality tends to be a bit more nebulous on like what it looks like to assess whether someone's moral, but things like competition tend to encourage this number. Who has the best number? I have a better score than you.
Seems like 2 directions. So they pull a person towards kind of different direction. I think you're absolutely right in that regard. And that was one of the main kind of tension I found in my research in the preschool. So it is that on the one hand, there is quite pervasive anxiety regarding how to cultivate a moral person. And that has been, I would say, the central Chinese philosophy, from political philosophy to educational philosophy to Chinese thought is very central. We have this term called becoming human, 做人, behaving in a humanly way. And it's really connected to this deep tradition of Confucian tradition of how to cultivate yourself. So, and Chinese education sees that as the ultimate goal for learning. It's not just learning some language, learning some skills, learning to explore the universe. It's ultimately is learning how to cultivate humans' inborn goodness to flourish, right? To bring it out to the fullest extent, so that the whole society and humankind can benefit from it. So that has been a long-standing thread. And in that particular social context, as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of anxiety about, okay, there is crisis going on of extortation, of low trust, of lack of empathy, and a lot of public incidents and debates in the society. And plus the only child, the worry about these generation of children. So parents do want their children to grow up to be caring, right, to be trusting, and all that, to be fair. But then the other part of the reality, which is very which is really weighty, is educational competition. As I mentioned, even for some preschool, they require interviews and screening and assessment. Yeah, not in that particular preschool I studied. And maybe later it got even worse in Shanghai and in Hong Kong and Beijing and major cities.
And just to be clear, for those preschools, how old are they when they're enrolled? Because you said that some of the students in your school were 2 years old. Are they being interviewed at 2? Or are they 3 or 4? This is very young.
Two is a special kind in that school system. 2 is like called kind of nursing class. In my book, okay. I translate as nursing class because it's for the youngest children whose family are either busy or they do want their children to have some experience of some sort of social life, collective life. And part of the reason is because most of these children are the singletons, right? So, but the pre-K is the age 3. Some schools had that interview, not in this particular school I studied. But imagine these children, they have to go through competition to get into a good elementary school. I remember at age 5, so the oldest grade, which is what we call 大班, big class, they were doing a lot of exams already, math and other things. So it's just like paper sheets exams. I don't think my son here in the US, who is a sophomore, finishing up his sophomore year, has that many exams, his weekly exams, paper sheets to cope with. And that's just a stark contrast. So in that regard, everyone, parents, educators, they're all worried and they do face that competition. It's very real. So I really felt for them. It's not easy to raise a child. You want a child. So that's I appreciate the question you asked. So there's absolute tension between becoming this moral person, also a happy person, right? Because another thread of discourse in China at the time is influenced by the Western liberal discourse of raising a happy child and all that, emotional development. So you also want a child to be happy, especially a young child, a preschool age child. So, but then this other thing that is very, to some extent, brutal to everyone, you have to negotiate with. So that's kind of the backdrop of this entire story. And parents feel confused, and it's not easy to navigate. So I admire every and each one of those Chinese parents that I interviewed and I spent time with to really pull this together. It's not easy.
Yeah. How do, in your experience, how do the parents approach this? Because it seems like, yeah, it would make sense that they also want their kid to be happy, but they also they're probably also under a lot of pressure to have their kid perform, under a sense that if they're not successful, they're not going to make it in life. How do they navigate that? And then maybe how do you navigate that, you as a parent who was maybe to some extent in China and then also in the US in a bit of a different system?
Right. So I would say maybe I was a coward. So I was born and raised in China, and I don't remember my childhood being that intense. We had exams and competition. We had this brutal entrance examination, and everybody wanted to go get to Tsinghua, Beida, the 2 most elite and famous and top universities in China. But when I was in Shanghai, I got there and enrolled my child in the school and started chatting with parents, I saw how much pressure they had. I had pressure too because I was raising a young child. I was a new mom, but I knew that I could come back. I would come back. It was just temporary. I was staying there for a year doing research. And my child, he was born here, so he would go through the American system. And that's part of the reason I wanted to stay here, for him to have an easier childhood, so to speak. But for those parents, it is really not easy to navigate. I remember, but there's, I always say, as everywhere, any topic, there is diversity, right? Different parents have their own different circumstances, philosophy. But I would say the big institutional constraint is that if you want your child to eventually go to college in China, you had to go through the competition. And every stage there is sorting assessment, starting from, in some extreme case, preschool and elementary school, then getting into a middle school, good middle school and good high school, not a vocational high school, but a good and maybe better high school that have a better chance of getting your child to college. And every stage there is sorting, meaning some kids cannot get to high school. And that's just the fact. It's how the quota and institution is set. And eventually you have to face the one-time exam that determines which university you go to. So that's the institutional picture. But for some parents, for example, in Shanghai and Beijing, who have more resources, they can send their children to an alternative school system, private school, international school, and eventually they skip the Chinese very, very demanding and competitive Chinese college entrance examination, and then they can do SAT, or other exams to go to America, Australia, England, and other parts of the world. Probably a lot of the friends you met who have Chinese background and they study abroad, if they go abroad as an undergrad student, meaning they didn't go through the Chinese exam, the entrance exam system, 高考. So there is so there's some sort of different profiles, or depending on your social class and also your vision for how you want your child to grow up and where you see your child eventually going. So for some parents, they can afford a more chill out childhood and approach, more kind of raising a happy child. But for most people, it's just impossible. So they have to face that competition. But even within that category, that inevitable 高考, doing undergrad education in China, there are still differences. I remember in that particular preschool, there was a father who was very conscious of the problems of education, and he often comes to chat with me. First of all, he was a very devoted father who was very involved in the child's education, which was not very common. It's normally the moms the moms who are more involved. So he was thinking about these issues and kind of wanted to resist that sort of pressure and carve out a space for his child to grow up, to have some sort of happy childhood. But there are also other parents who are happy to kind of, to embrace this competition. I remember there's a teacher in the school. I like her a lot. She's from this particular part of China, Shandong province, Confucius' hometown, which is known for its rigorous competition and onerous studying, all that educational culture. I don't know whether her geographic background can explain that, but I remember that case. Her son, they moved from Shandong to Shanghai. Her son was maybe 5 at the time. She signed the child up for 8 different extracurriculum classes during the weekend.
Oh wow!
So that's a preschool child, and that's the cram school schedule. But she said that's the way to go, and you just have to embrace it and just full speed. So I'm sure there's in China is so large. There is different types of parents navigating in their own ways, but facing some common constraints.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, a lot of my I've talked to a number of friends, kind of young adults, maybe 25 to 35, who have grown up who basically tell me about how they almost feel like shell shocked from how they grew up in the education system with the cram schools. They'll talk about like, I had to, study 17 hours a day, basically all the time, every single day, except for 7 hours of sleep at night. And then just kind of do that like every single day. And they felt like it was very stressful. some of them live in China. Some of them have opted to move to other places, like you said. But a lot of them kind of I talked to in other countries as they move out, and they would start to say like, I think that gave them a different perspective. But like this, um, there's a lot of individuals, so different people seem to have different experiences. I'm focusing on some people that had bad experiences with this, but there seems to be a lot there. And like you said, like 8 hours of extracurriculars. It actually might be helpful to describe when you're saying extracurriculars, like what kind of extracurricular courses are these? Like I'm assuming this isn't like gym and like a shop class or something, which is what this is too old for for a shop class, but like what we would associate with high school extracurriculars in the U.S. Like what kind of things when they take these additional courses are they studying usually?
Yeah. So at that particular time, 2011, 2012, it was not as intense and as many variety than today. But I keep following Chinese education as a researcher, also as a Chinese mother through friends and other circles. In the school I studied, they had, of course, they have main subject, which is like English, math, and Chinese language, Chinese calligraphy. And also for those young children, they cannot learn calculus then, right? But they can learn an instrument, singing. And it was very, very common to do instruments. And then competition level gets pretty high. And also some sports. I think that was like, along with China's social change and economic boom, and a lot of new things got introduced. And later I heard, for example, friends in Beijing, kind of horse riding. You have to go to the suburb. You know that not in the city of Beijing, you don't have fields for riding horses, horse riding. But a lot of the so-called cram school is more academic subjects oriented. And they kind of have to do so because in elementary and later middle school, high school, if you don't do cram school, it's hard for you to catch up because the teachers will assume that everybody else is doing some cram school, and I'm not going to teach those kind of content. I assume you all know it. So you kind of have to be like everybody else. You have to go do these extra schoolwork. So there is academic cram school, and most famous is the Math Olympics. They really do hardcore math problems. So math, English, and these are very popular. And then sports and music. I think recently, because China hosted Winter Olympics a few years ago, skiing, snow sports, skiing, snowboarding have become popular, even starting from young. So it's the competition, it's like arms race. The age gets younger and younger, and the variety of things, because then you can, as you said, part of the competition is about standing out, right? If everybody, the violin is becoming so common, why don't I learn, I don't know, French horn or some other things? But I would like to say that maybe for many children, it is challenging and stressful to grow up in that intense, hyper-competitive environment. But being a mother and having this cross-cultural experience myself, I feel like I gain also my perspective is enriched. I would wonder those who chose to leave China. At any point, do they regret their decisions? There are many families who decide to leave for a better or an easier education for their children. Not necessarily better, right? But maybe less stressful education. But on the flip side, I do realize, and I'm not alone. I talk to friends. The American system also is not as ideal as I had once kind of hoped for.
What do you
so
mean?
Maybe preschool and things for younger children, they're very happy. They're having a lot of fun, right? They're high self-esteem and all that. But two things. First is I feel like later, middle school, high school, they could have learned a little bit more. My child goes to a public school, and it's a pretty good school within the Seattle public school system. And we constantly talk to friends, Chinese friends or friends from other cultures, from Europe and elsewhere. We do worry, like this curriculum and the kind of the standards seem to be lower and lower, and the grades are inflated. And there's even a report from UCSD or some other UC school system saying that the high school education doesn't seem to prepare the kids well enough to cope with freshman college content, especially math and some maybe STEM areas. So in that regard, I always wonder, we tend to project, right? We don't, because we don't know the other culture, so we project our own fantasies and desires onto the other culture, right? When I was in China, my understanding about American society, American education system was all very rosy. But then coming here and after so many years and seeing daily news and all that, your perspective with age and experience maybe switch a little bit. Not saying that I regret my decision to raise my child here. I'm just saying that I realize that I have my own biases. American people can have their own biases too, Chinese people too. So my child, he's an interesting example because he's also fluent in Chinese Mandarin, and he goes to China to visit grandparents and family quite a bit. So I asked him, he enjoys being in China because people are very, very nice to him, and there's a lot to eat, great food, and lot of things to explore. He said he only wants to go on vacation because the school system, occasionally we talk about, okay, do you want to go to school in China? No. He knew how hard it is. Every time he goes back, he talks to his second cousins, because I am an only child. He realized the gap. Kids 2 years younger than him in math, there's way more advanced math than what he was doing. I'm not saying that this is bad, like which side is better. I'm just saying that for him, it's also interesting experience to have this cross-cultural kind of perspective. And then he got to think about education can have different forms and different trajectories. So there's that. So for me, my personal experience and also from my friends and my own observation. The other thing is the past year, I had a new project. It's a cross-cultural comparative project. On one side is in Seattle. I was particularly studying Chinese American children. And Seattle has a lot of Seattle has a high income strata, right? And also have a lot of people working in tech and all that, and has a lot of Chinese immigrants. So when I get to know the immigrants here, and it's not just the Chinese, but a lot of the non-Chinese from other ethnicities too, here the competition, especially some private schools, can also get pretty stressful. The kids, horse riding and all that, sports, golf, 6-year-old doing golf national tournaments and things. And
wow.
That's also for me, yeah, 6-year-old golf competition, not to mention instruments. There's just like arms race. I just feel like it's maybe to some extent is a class thing. That if you want to really, as you said, if you want to stand out, if all you care about is getting into Ivy League, regardless if you are Chinese or white or whatever ethnicity, you have to play the game, and the game rules might not be that different from those people competing in the game in China.
Yeah, what you're saying makes total sense. I'm going to share 3 quick stories that will connect the different threads of what you said. One, in terms of some of my friends have moved back to China. Some of my friends never intended to leave China in the first place. Maybe they studied at a different country for a couple years with the intent to go move back to China. That was where they intended to settle. To people who were like, to heck with this place, I want to go live somewhere else. Like anywhere between those extremes. but a couple of my friends, they were like, I don't want to go, they're like, I'm done with the place. And then a couple years later, they're like, no, I'm strongly considering moving back. And one thing I think I've learned in life, if there's only one thing, is that our goals and maybe even on some level who we are, but like our goals and our intents change vastly over the course of our lives. And like what I wanted in life 6 years ago is completely different than what I want now. And 6 years before that was different again. And that actually I think is one con of a lot of like ethnographic anthropology research, also psychology research, is that most of it tends to get people where they're at that time. You interview someone, you
Mm-hmm.
get their snapshot then and there, and you get their projections of where they'll be in the future, but they could completely change in 10 years from now in ways that are completely unforeseen in what they want. There are ways around that, like multi-year ethnographies. We don't have to go into that. That's a conversation to itself. But that was one of the first thoughts with what you were saying. The other thing with the U.S., um, yeah, so I used to teach high school math. So I used to teach kind of the opposite age as preschoolers, but my personal experience with the US, so there's two big issues. One is the huge educational inequality.
Right.
Like I happen to go to one of the best schools, public schools in my state, Pennsylvania, and I've
Mm-hmm.
taught at schools that were very structurally disadvantaged, where the students did not have very good access to education,
Right.
which can be very sad. Like they're almost not given the proper opportunities to excel in the ways that they should. Um, the focus on the first, because I think the elite schools more connect to what some of the dynamics you were talking about. The other
Right.
schools have different problems. Um, in my personal experience, like in my high school growing up, I think what it gave was opportunity, but we had a lot of freedom in what we did with that. So
Mm-hmm.
like one could get a phenomenal education that where one learned a lot. Like I learned to pick on math, but like math is one of my things. I studied in college both math and anthropology, so I really love math.
It's
Um,
cool. Yeah.
yeah, so like I took like 3 years of level math in high school. I took both calculuses, two years of calculus and linear algebra. And like linear algebra is very rarely offered in high school. Like there's a lot of opportunities, but like you could also just kind of go and coast and kind of do whatever. So like there was a bit of a, and with teenagers, like people as a teenage years are in very different places mentally, as their adolescence is notorious for like you could just like there's a lot of, I'm gonna say there's a lot of opportunity, but there's not necessarily a like push to seek it. It's there,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to like go after it, which means that for a young
Right.
adult, they have to have that initiative to do that, which isn't developmentally where everyone's at. Um, but the other side, like for me personally, and this I think kind of relates to what you're saying. So like you were talking about calculus and teaching calculus. I have taught. I also used to teach in middle school and high school. I taught calculus to middle schoolers. I found that seventh and eighth grade, they're able to understand calculus. In math world, basically, you have to understand how slope works. If you can find a slope of a line, I can get you into derivatives and then get you into calculus from there.
Mm-hmm.
But so maybe not 4 year olds, but like
Right.
11 year olds, yeah, or maybe 12 year olds, yes.
Right.
And but like it was something that like I remember my dad actually when at one point when I was in seventh grade, we were driving like through the mall one day, and I just randomly asked him what's calculus, and my dad sat down. Well, we were in the car. He was already sitting. He explained the fundamentals of calculus for the next 2 hours. a lot of it was driving, which is not easy because calculus is very visual. It's better to draw it, to see it. But like you can do it. And I think that was what inspired me to teach the younger kids. It was a bit of a like, you guys are not given access to some of the more advanced math. Let's start here. And give you something that you guys find interesting. They wanted to learn it. But I think for me personally, that was very much because this is subtle. I would have to like really investigate its impact. But I think that was the big thing for me, was that like I was curious, and my parents, I could just go up and be like, what is this? And they would sit down and they would teach it. I guess that was kind of my equivalent of an extracurricular, but that was much more open. The reason why I bring the second story up, or the third story, I mean, is that I wonder if there's a good middle ground between pushing people and like encouraging people to learn without, like, on the one extreme, you can kind of shove learning down people's throats, and it becomes like an awful experience. Or you can just have people where they are, which for little kids means they're gonna just sit there and, do not learning. They're gonna do something else with their time. I wonder if there's a good middle ground to kind of use curiosity or something where they kind of encourage as they go. Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. As you mentioned, like maybe 11, 12-year-olds, they have the capacity to learn, right? Certain more advanced maths, especially for some children, because every child is different and their interests differ. I think that's one thing I am a little bit worried about. It's like we do want every child to reach their potential, right? Because that's the golden age for learning. And then sometimes maybe here the school systems, well, there are really lack of funding. Like Seattle school system is constantly, we receive emails of teachers on strike, a school system don't have enough funding. So it is sad. And it does make me wonder, so what does this country value if not education? Isn't that the most important thing, right? To educate our next generation. And speaking of inequality, right? The public schools, they serve the vast majority of people, right? Who need those resources and who need the infrastructure for their children to have any chance to succeed and have a better life in the future. So why can't we have more sort of, resources and support for the education system, and also to tap the children, to tap into their potential, because each and every of these children it's quite precious. And sometimes having some sort of, I wouldn't say huge stress, but have some sort of goal and standard is good, right? So I think in that regard, it's really, for me, I would be curious, are there any sort of experiments, not in the sense of lab experiment, but kind of social experiments, to try to have a system, education system, that can absorb the strengths from different cultures, right? Rather than just feeling good about ourselves and we don't care and we don't want to learn from other cultures, or we just project our stereotypes onto Chinese or Asian, East Asian, whatever education system. So each has its own, I would say, drawback and also advantages. And for me, as a Chinese American parent, I constantly think about those questions. I remember once I did a podcast with a local group of Chinese women who are interested in education related topics. And before I joined that podcast, I asked my son, so do you think I am doing an okay job balancing the Chinese and American educational approaches? He was like, yeah, I think so. So that was great comfort, because as a parent, you do worry, right? You do worry that you're not doing enough. You either are not doing enough or you're doing too much. So I think for parents and educators and educational system, it's maybe we're all kind of struggling with where is the golden balance point to help our children thrive and succeed in the future. Especially the next generation with AI and everything, nobody knows how they're gonna, what kind of world they're facing, and what kind of skills, and be it intellectual skills, emotional capacities, or other, social skills or academic skills. What are the most essential to prepare them for the future world, and what are the ways that we can implement those?
Yeah, this makes total sense. I'm going to respond to the second part first, and then talk about the parent part, and then talk about the schooling part in a second. But with the parents, yeah, I think one thing that in my limited experience, my limited understanding, talking to people, parents, that would be both the case broadly in China and the United States, is that parenting has almost become this big source of anxiety.
Yeah.
And I think it's inherent in the question of what's the right way to do it. Like, what
Right.
am I doing it right? Am I blah blah blah? Am I gonna mess up my kid? Am I gonna blah, blah, and
Right.
um I I it's not like I have like a golden answer to that, but one of my first thoughts on that, I mean, part of me is like, does it really have to be that? I think there's something that has, I mean, on some level, parenting has always been a major stress, probably in every parent's life throughout human history. It's a major life event but like, does it have to be this anxious? I guess, and
Right.
my sense is that it's been constructed that way over the last couple decades. The classic anthropology statement, it's a social construct, that this
Construct.
specific form of it has been constructed in some way, in which case it could be constructed differently. I mean, my initial high level thought is that I think parenting, it's like a garden. It's like raising a garden. Like, you tend to a garden, but you also, like, garden is about raising a plant in a garden, is about giving the plant what it needs to do its own thing, fundamentally. Like,
Right.
the plant's going to do its own
Right.
thing. You still might need to do things, especially if you're raising a plant that's not used to the specific climate that you're used to, or some plants are more picky than others. But like, it's fundamentally about like, but like, if you don't do anything for a week, the plant's still going to do its thing, and
Right.
you might still get a flower, whatever. Like, that was my first thought. Now, I'm not a parent, so what do I know? That could be like the kind of thing, if I ever become a parent in the future, where I say it now, thinking about it not as a parent, and then suddenly I'm like, how naive you were that day. But that was kind of my first thought. Like, kids grow up.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have, psychologically, we have the mechanisms in place to develop, but it's about cultivating it, and seeing that process through, rather than doing the process. Because doing
Right.
the process can be very anxiety producing. um, I think it can contribute to that. It can contribute to I have to make all the right decisions for my kid. um,
Impossible.
right, right.
Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I don't think anybody will solve this problem, because the anxiety will always be there, especially in this modern world, facing all kinds of economic crisis and labor market uncertainties. So but as a parent, I think you learn most. For me, the most joyful. I mean, painful and joyful, they are the same. It's like you learn what parenting is all about. Of course, you love your children, but you realize the child is different from you. So you do need to have that separation, even though you're so close, like mother and son, you're so close. And you do realize that's why I study child development. The children, they're amazing. Each child has their own little world and their own trajectory. So part of the comforting thing I say to myself is I cannot handle that much pressure or guilt or things like that. And as a working parent, I also want to enjoy my life. I want to do my work, and I want to also spend as much time and give much support as possible to my son. And I realized that maybe it's good that I don't think too much. For example, now he's 16, and people ask me, what major does he want to do and what school? I'm like, I don't know. You have to ask him. We have these conversations, and I do realize that I think maybe with age you become wiser. One thing to make you wiser is to learn that there's just so much you can do as a parent, and child development doesn't entirely depend on your input, your work, your effort, your nagging and things. And they are their own little persons, and they actively learn from all kinds of ways, right? They observe you, they learn from their peers, they learn from playing video games, listening to music, and reading books and all that. You are just a small part of his world, and that part will become smaller and smaller as the child grows up. So I think that's, for me, I keep saying that to myself, because how can I be responsible for his own life? He's gonna build his own life on his own, right? Not that I can determine. So there's the doing too much or doing too little. I don't think there's any. First of all, there's no perfect solution, and there's no one size fits all solution. But then parents, especially moms, we have more penalty normally the society imposes on us. We do face a lot of pressures, and we do experience a lot of guilt and all kinds of mixed emotions. But at the end of the day, if I look back on my own journey, did I really listen to my parents? Not necessarily. And I won't listen to them. That's the whole point, especially as adolescent. You have to make your own decisions, and you would regret if you don't, to some extent, break apart from your parents, right? Build your own self. So when I think about that, then it makes me feel slightly better thinking about my child's future. That, and we have Chinese saying in that regard too. We are sun zhu, are sun fu. The children and offspring have their own blessings, and it's not entirely up to you.
I like that. I mean, I don't. You said it's the children of spring have their own blessings.
Children and offspring. It's literally is children and grandchildren. They have their own blessings.
Oh,
That's
I
the
like
Chinese
that.
saying.
Well, what I heard was a little different, and I liked what I heard too, even though it was a little more ambiguous what it was saying. I thought it was also I heard like children of spring, so I thought it was like associating children with spring, or a like
Oh,
the
right.
children bloom suddenly, like the flowers sudden bloom in spring. Often in spring, the flowers bloom out completely out of nowhere. At least to me, maybe they're more predictable, and I'm just bad at predicting it. But I'm like it'll be snow, and then suddenly I'm like flowers, a bunch of flowers, that's really pretty. But like that was the other thing I was thinking about. Like kids bloom often in their own time. Like they
Right.
some kids and often their journey, like there are many, because if we're focusing on high school, there are many kids that struggle in high school and then kind of really get things when they're older, maybe early 20s, maybe mid 20s. Maybe they never get it, but like they get it at a later stage. Some kids are really together in high school and then kind of explode later and then have to kind of rebuild themselves. But like these
Right.
journeys can be very non-linear. I think sometimes kids struggling actually depends. It obviously depends on how they struggle, but some struggles lead to us getting stronger, and some struggles are get almost necessarily grafted in. It's like a tree. It's like you can see, if you look up a tree, you can almost see its story of how different things happened at different moments that caused the different shapes of the trees. Um,
Right. Right. I like the tree metaphor. That reminds me of a Chinese saying, because in Chinese culture, children, childhood, and education always interpreted it through some plant-related metaphors. I think I've even written about it in some academic articles. And this one thing just stood out to me is it takes 10 years to grow a tree, cultivate a tree. It takes 100 years to cultivate a person. So it means that education is so important. It's using the tree as a metaphor. It's a natural process, but it's also you need to take it seriously. It takes 100 years to grow. So that's back to the emphasis on education in Chinese culture, and also what you mentioned earlier is so resonating with me about each child has their own journey, right? They bloom at different points. Maybe they get interested in different areas. My own child too. He plays the violin, and now it's almost 11 years by now learning the violin. So when he was younger, he wasn't that interested in the violin. He was just doing Suzuki lessons and practice here and there. And of course, there will be tension. Universally, Suzuki violin parents, you have to supervise the practice and learning and the retention. And then since he got to middle school, the orchestra director really kindled his interest or rekindled of violin. So he's been through the pandemic, several years doing Zoom lessons, and then he got a little bit bored. And then he got into middle school that was post-COVID, almost post-COVID, and playing in a group, in an orchestra, really, he understood the beauty of music. And then he became more interested in the violin. It just really, not that I pushed him or forced him or anything like that. It's just his natural growth. And he got more and more interested. It's not easy to learn the violin. And also, we never force him, you have to be a musician, which is a very competitive and difficult route. So I learned to appreciate that. Appreciate, he is different from me. I grew up as a child who was so self-driven, loves schooling, loves every subject of school, and wants to win at every possible exams in the Chinese system. He's not like that. And I learned to respect that. I think that is the biggest lesson I learned as a parent, as a researcher who studies education and child development and parenting. And the second thing is I really do observe the individuality, right? And his interest growing. And having an interest such as music is so beautiful, and he gets to immerse himself into that. He appreciates the beauty. He wants to learn more. But sadly, it's not my fantasy, or just, it's not that, meaning I said this based on what I read from research. I was reading a research article published by a sociologist looking at college tutors, and based on different ethnicities, studied in New York and California, I think. And one shocking thing, maybe I shouldn't be so shocked, but one thing I learned is that as an Asian child, if you write in your college essay that you love piano, plays the piano or the violin, you would be, so the assumption is your parents forced you to. Mm-hmm. So you have to explain yourself. You have to prove that you do this extracurricular activity, this main hobby, not because you were pushed by your parents, you're forced by your parents, or you only care about winning at competition and excelling at a certain level, but you have to prove to whoever's reviewing that essay that you have a genuine interest and passion in music. And that's specifically targeting Asian children. That made me sad, I was like, then how can we even profile children like that? It's a bit, and it's based on solid research, ethnographic research, and sociological research. But I'm sure different groups face their own hurdles and discrimination and issues and inequality. But I don't know how I can tell my child, you have to prove yourself that you really do love the violin. You have to somehow explain that you're not forced by your parents, or you're not doing it purely for external reward.
Yeah.
And that's
This makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of stereotypes about Asian Americans in the U.S., maybe Chinese Americans in particular. I don't know how I would prove that too, unless like, like, unless I. So I don't play any of these instruments, but as a hypothetical, if I were in that situation and as a Chinese American, I would like if I happen to have like a clear story of like I wanted to play this, but my parents were hesitant, and so like a key part of it was I wanted this, but they were, like you could play up that side of the story because it makes you seem like no, this is my passion, but like that might not be everyone's story who's just interested in it. I yeah, that I I mean, college admissions essays have their own, like, I guess this is one, I think, overall problem with stereotypes is that, like, how do you disprove a stereotype? Especially when it's in someone else's mind. Like, if someone else is coming in with the conception of X, on some level, like, we can change people's minds. And I think there is a good argument that it isn't, often in the US, for example, people of color get put in a position where they're almost expected to like correct people's stereotypes of them. And no, that's not their job. Though some people of color specifically do that. It's almost like a vocation for them as those specific individuals. And some people do that as their job. Like there are that, but that's a relatively low percent. But like, um, but like it's in their mind, and it filters how they conceive of things. It just kind of stinks. And if that hurts that person's prospects because they're writing a genuine essay about this, but the other person doesn't read it as genuine, yeah, that's very difficult. And I think that's actually one problem with college admission essays too, is that like you write this thing from your mindset and you don't always know the mindset or the perspective of who's going to read it and how they're going to interpret it, because they're interpreting it far away from you, and there's a bit of a veil there. I don't know if that makes sense.
Right. So I think that's I mean, to spin it to a more positive side, maybe that's part of the charm and value for having cross-cultural experiences. Like you mentioned, you talked to a lot of Chinese, the young adults. They lived in different parts of the world. I think in that regard, it's nice to, I at least in my example, I think it's nice that, for example, my son has he grew up here, but he also gets to appreciate and see another society, in Chinese society. So he understands that a construct can have different meanings, right? For example, what does leadership mean? It's so important in the US. When I first got here, that struck me as such a significant concept in American education. Back then in China, I don't think we learned much about leadership, but that doesn't mean the Chinese students don't have leadership, right? Or maybe leadership means something different. And that's the beauty of this studying anthropology. Is like you have to encounter different groups and different cultures, right, to understand that the same thing can mean very differently across different contexts. Also, maybe it's really, sometimes it's hard to even translate any given concept cross-culturally and in another language. So sometimes I follow the conversation here because I am very American by now. I've been living here such a long time. It's criticism about Chinese Americans here or Chinese people in general in China, that education, there's no innovation, and so on and so forth. I feel like maybe we can both learn from each other, have a more humble attitude, a more open mind. For me, that's always something to guide myself. Because in the past, I tend to also think, okay, Chinese system, a lot of memorization and things. But then after coming here and see my child growing up and going through the education system, some of the things that it doesn't hurt to memorize more knowledge and stuff, right? And I think of this particular example, learning the Chinese script. He's learning, in fact, even right now, he's doing a Chinese online lesson on writing Chinese essays. The Chinese script is very hard. And as a young child, I totally don't remember how I learned to write in Chinese, but I'm sure there's a lot of drilling, memorization, and just practice. You have to, I see now my cousin's children, they're younger, they have to each character and write 100 times. And it's boring and it's painful, and why can't I just play? Of course. But then at the end of the day, some skills do need repetition and do need memorization, right? So just that, from observing my son, to learn the script, of course, he doesn't have the environment to immerse himself in, but I realized that how easily you can lose that memory if you don't practice enough. And the even more interesting story I wanted to share is that this tradition has been so long-standing in Chinese history. I recently visited Dunhuang. It's a very famous world cultural heritage site. Is in northwest China. It's on the Silk Road, ancient Silk Road. It was a very important hub in the ancient Silk Road. And in that area, I visit museum exhibits, and also from the caves itself, there are bamboo slips from more than 1,000 years ago, Roman Empire's time, maybe China's Han Dynasty. A lot of preserved bamboo slips. And some of them are government, a lot of them are government documents, right? I need to write, tell this soldier this thing, tell that official that thing, tell my wife. As a soldier, I tell my family, send a letter to my family. But there are also a particular type of bamboo slips that is children or young people learning the Chinese script. They practice on the bamboo slip, and they in some rare occasions, you even get to see the story. A child practice this bunch of things and have to submit this to the teacher, then complain that this is so tiring, this is a lot. And I was like, wow, this is over 1,000 years ago. And maybe that's part of the reason the Chinese culture has survived so many crises and ups and downs. And I think the emphasis in education is it in and of itself a good thing, right? But then it can go to the too much of extreme and having too much pressure and competition or inequality. But I do want to emphasize, especially now here in America, at this particular moment, historical time, I do feel like we should emphasize the value of education more, not less. And maybe it is also good for us Americans to learn from Chinese education and other education systems.
Yeah, this makes sense. I mean, real quick on the writing, I do remember one of my ex-girlfriends who was originally from Thailand. She spoke like 5 or 6 languages, depending on how you defined fluent. We'll say 5.5. but she told me she's like one time I tried to learn Chinese, and she's like, I got so lost in their writing system. She struggled with it so much. She's like, I spent 2 months trying to figure it out, and then she's just like, meh. She found it too hard. And unlike me, who struggles more with any language, she is pretty good with languages, but like that, the writing system in particular kind of defeated her. But yeah, um, on and I love looking at like the ancient, like here were the scribes like testing things out, like in ancient Egypt there are those too, like in ancient Mesopotamia. Those are some of my favorite of like the historical
Right.
documents that we have. um but yeah, so in terms of um where we're at in the US right now, what do you think, like what lessons do you think we can learn from the Chinese education system, or from other, I was going to ask also, and from other education systems, but that might be too broad. Let's focus on China. Like what do you think are some of the biggest lessons to learn?
I think first of all is the value placed on education. You just education is important. It's inherently important, right? Of course, many people or many institutions or many political systems might have ulterior motives. Okay, it's education is about sorting people out, it's about this and that, or it's about getting a better job. Of course, those are all natural, and those are here too, and that's just very universal. But this inherent value placed in education, in and of itself, and learning, for me, it's I didn't appreciate as much when I was young and in China. Um, but now that I look back, I do feel like that's just very important. You learn the knowledge that people cumulatively have passed on, transmitted, and proven important. So, and then Chinese culture particularly, because we had a long tradition of exam system before that, and even before the exam system was formally in place, and directly linked to mobility, right, to having a government position and enjoying status. Um, Education is always emphasized. Of course, in ancient times, it's not only the elite or certain men, right, from certain families, but then in modern times, expanded to include to has become a public good. I think that's the most important. So it doesn't have to be specific academic knowledge, but just the idea of it's important for the next generation to become educated people. That in and of itself, I feel like it's important. I think along with that is the respect for educators. So my parents, they are school teachers, and in the Chinese system, people have of course, it's school teacher is not the money making professions, but somehow you have some respect in the society connected to the previous point that I mentioned, because people value education, and you know that as a teacher you are actually impacting the next generation. So I think that also can be something to be learned. Yeah, I think those are the two main points I can think of. Of course, the specifics and how you impart learning and knowledge, those all differ across culture, right? Or what domains of knowledge will be seen as more important depending on the market and institutions and a bunch of factors. But generally,
Yeah,
valuing education and respecting the education system. Yeah.
yeah, this makes sense. I mean, um I do. I agree with you, and I do think I think you're onto something with both. I mean, I think it seems to me my that both countries have issues with inequality in their education system.
Right. Right.
China's might be a rural urban divide, and the U.S. might be like an urban suburban, also rural, but urban suburban divide. But I think it's very important to make sure that every single kid gets education, and I think education is super important. I do think, I mean, you can look at this now. You can look at this kind of like what you're saying. You can look at this historically with China, but like historically, China. Well, like 1,000 or 2 years ago is a very different society, but like some of the China was some of the first like major instances of developing at least mass institutions of education, and
Right.
solidifying the state, solidifying you get promoted based off of education. You get promoted based off of your ability to learn, as opposed to I think as best, as opposed to something like you get promoted based off of your uncle being the king or whoever, based off of family connections. Uh, um, yeah, I absolutely agree. One final question, as we're talking about broad, um, potentially unfair questions, like the last one. What advice, we were talking about parenting? What advice would
Mhm.
you have, based off of your own research, for anyone who's a parent?
Oh, wow. What a exciting but also challenging question.
Yeah.
Um, because I study moral development, but also study education and learning more broadly, and particularly from a cross-cultural perspective, and also crossing disciplinary lines. I study children's developing psychology, their minds, and also I study anthropology, which tend to focus more on societies and cultures. So for me, if anything, maybe I will share two of my observations. Uh, One is we should see children as active learners. I think even in academia, in anthropology, we tend to see parenting as a very top-down project, right? It's transmitting cultural knowledge or moral values from the elderly generation to the young generation. But actually, my research was kind of flipping that around to see and find that young children they're very smart and sensitive. They develop very rich social cognitive abilities, moral sensitivities, and emotions, even from a young age, if from preschool age. And they're very intelligent learners in the sense that they learn from a variety of ways. They observe, they play through play, not just through you explicitly teaching them. So I think that's the number one. That's to see children as active learners, rather than passive recipients of
Mm,
any knowledge or cultural values or moral rules. And the second one is maybe related to the first point, is that at the end of the day, parenting is just a small part in a child's long life trajectory. And maybe we can take it easy instead of stressing ourselves out. Meaning there is a limit of how much influence you as a parent can exert on your child. For me, that's a comfort knowing that. Knowing that for me is to become wiser, to not push too much or feel too anxious. I think that's good for both parents and for children, and even in moral development too. They learn from peers. My second book on a Han Taiwanese village is mainly focused on how children learn all these negotiate cooperation and learn morality through interacting with their siblings and peers,
mm,
rather than the conventional impression about traditional Han Chinese family is all about obedience, is about filial piety, is about parents imparting knowledge in a very didactic way. Rather, it's about children learning amongst themselves. So, in that regard, parenting is might not be as important and as we might think. It is important, but it might not be that that important, which is good, and realize that we have a limit and that learning and becoming moral is thankfully made possible by children's smart brains. They're developing cognitive and emotional sensitivities, and also made possible by the larger world. The very fact that they are living in a and participating in a very complex and rich social life, and parents are just a small part of that social life.
That this makes total sense. I get one thought I had. I'll phrase it as a question, but I guess it's kind of a thought. To what extent do you think that makes parenting less important, or do you think it makes it just leads to a different type of parenting? Like in my mind, like if the model of parenting is what do I need to impart on my kid, then it's I have to conceive of all of it and then give it and then figure out how to give it to my kid or get my kid to get it, whether that's me directly saying it to them or imparting them and enrolling them in the right classes or the right extracurriculars that does that, whatever that looks like. um and that seem very stressful. It's like the as a teacher analogy, it would be like lecturing. If I lecture, I'm doing all the work of here is the
Right.
knowledge, and I'm figuring out how to give it to you in a way that makes sense to you uh, as a classroom full of students. As opposed to something like the teacher, like the parent's role is to facilitate, is to help produce an environment in which the kid can
Right.
learn with others, with other peers, with other adults, with whoever. And in the teaching world, that would be like the equivalent of like the teacher's role is to produce an environment in which the student can do things that cause them to learn, that they can do things on their
Right.
own. um, I guess in my mind, parenting would be just as important there, but it's less intense and it's more indirect. It's more like cultivating a garden than um, being an architect trying to build the tree itself. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree um, that it is about creating a loving, supportive environment, and also creating structure and boundary. If we speak of morality, of course, setting up boundary and everything is important, because at the end of the day, you are the first, most intimate people in their life, especially during the earlier years. But on the other hand, children, they also learn from the larger world, not just the intimate family environment. So in my research, for example, both my first book that was based on a preschool in Shanghai, and also the second book, quote unquote unruly children, it's about rural children in Taiwan during the late 1950s, early 1960s. They actually learn more information. They know a lot more than what parents might, in their immediate environment. They learn from TV or in Taiwan in radio and internet and things. You'd be surprised that they also observe how the adults interact in the larger society. So in that regard, parents are very important, but also it's a small part of the increasingly enlarged world that children participate in.
Yeah, that makes
If
sense.
that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean that reminds me of the famous African proverb. I don't know where I've heard this attributed to different parts of Africa, so I'm just going to say Africa because I've heard all sorts of different places. Which is it takes a village to raise a child,
Right. Right.
kind of idea. Um, yeah, this makes sense.